You know, when it comes to resumes, a lot of people are confused these days on how to format them. There's a lot of different opinions out there. I just tell people to keep it simple, be sure that there's ample white space, to be sure that you don't use a font that is too complicated. You want to be sure that in today's days of electronic scanning that the font can be picked up. So using a font such as Times New Roman or Arial would be appropriate. And also to be sure that it is a nice readable size, such as no smaller than 11 point and preferably even 12 point as well. There's, two types of basic formats for resumes. There's the chronological, which many people use and which employers tend to prefer, which is exactly like it sounds. It's starting with, in the work history section of the resume, with listing your most recent employer and those job titles starting with most recent and working your way back. Now, for some people, it's appropriate to use what's called the functional resume, where instead of a lot of detail with one's work history, instead it will actually pick out certain qualifications or capabilities that a person has that is really targeted to the type of job field that they're targeting. It might be things like, let's say, teamwork or project management. It might be presentations. It might be leadership. And under those particular qualities or qualifications, the person will bullet out below that in a short sentence or so, or phrase, would be their specific accomplishments and how they have supported that particular qualification. In addition, with the volume of work that people have today, sometimes the resume will spill into a second page, and that is totally appropriate. But of course, if you are going to go to a second page on your resume, first of all, you want to be sure that you pretty much fill up that complete second page, or sometimes you can do a little bit of tweaking with the formatting. But then also to be sure that if in case those pages get separated, that you lead off at the top with your first and last name and the fact that it is page 2. And of course, these are copied single-sided, not back to back. But I was mentioning earlier the point about the web-based resumes today and emailing them. It's important also to be sure that there are words and phrases or keywords that are picked up, because that's what employers are looking for to help sort you out as a candidate that might be brought in for an interview.
Yeah, web-based resumes sometimes will have a section all of its own of just keywords. Just single words and maybe 2 or 3 columns that the scanner will be able to pick up very, very easily, so that the employer will be able to recognize that candidate as being a very qualified person. You had mentioned about white space. Using paragraphs that are more than 3 or 4 lines long, a person will run the hazard of perhaps losing some information in the middle of those paragraphs when the employer is scanning it. So by breaking it out into those short phrases, in those bullets that we were talking about, will create an easier way for an employer to identify those most important things, because there won't be any clutter in the resume, or it won't get lost in the paragraph. So simply what that white space is just the area of the resumes that are blank that will make it easier for the employer to identify those most important credentials that you're trying to get them to recognize, especially in a functional resume, since employers aren't really used to seeing that kind. And because it's a more unusual resume, they're going to have to be able to pick up those things a lot easier, so that they identify that candidate as being one of the best that they have available to them.
Sure. And one thing about chronological resumes too that we need to keep in mind is also the piece of where do we show, let's say, education versus work history. If a person, let's say, has recently completed their education, and maybe they're switching fields, do not have a lot of experience in that, it would be appropriate to have that education showing very near the top of the resume, say right after your summary or summary of qualifications. On the other hand, if you have significant work experience in an area and do have some kind of training, education, certification, I would suggest that you lead with your work history first and then follow it with the education, because that kind of formalizes that credential, but the employer is going to be more attracted by your significant history in that area.
Right. Whatever qualifies you for the job the most should be listed towards the top of the resume. Those details that are important but may not be the thing that the employer is going to deem most important, right, you want those later on the resume, or if it's a 2-page resume, probably on the second page.
Yes, definitely.